In this video, we're going to talk about fictional protagonists as outsiders. Writer Joseph Bates once said, "We root for a character because the odds are stacked against him or her." And I think this is a really interesting way to frame our conversation about protagonists as outsiders. One way that a writer can craft that character to help us identify with them and root for them is by making them an outsider. And a lot of fictional protagonists are often outsiders in the world of their story. Now, this can take a couple of different shapes. They may be literal outsiders. They may have trouble fitting in with others. They may have a distinguishing mark or a characteristic that sets them apart from others. Or they may see things differently from others around them. And some protagonists start out as insiders and then later become outsiders as the plot unfolds. Their outsider status often affects their motivations and their behavior, and that's one of the things that we're going to explore today. So an example of a protagonist who is a literal outsider, who does not belong in her setting, in her environment, is Kipo Oak from the show Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts on Netflix. And in this show, Kipo is a girl who lives in an underground burrow, and she has to evacuate during an emergency. She gets separated from her dad, and she finds herself on the surface for the first time. And because this is her first time on the surface, because Kipo has never been there before, she doesn't really understand the rules of survival. And she stands out quite a lot from her friends Benson and Wolf and Dave. And I think this is a really interesting one to keep in mind, especially for those of you who like to read sci-fi and fantasy, because you'll often find our protagonist is an outsider because it's a way for the author to introduce us, the reader, to the world of the text. You know, in sci-fi and fantasy, we often have a lot of world building. That goes for dystopic fiction, that goes for a lot of things that we are going to find that are set in the future, or in an alternate world or an alternate reality. The writer has to give us a little taste of that and introduce us to that one bit at a time. And a way for them to do that, especially in fiction writing, is through the eyes of the protagonist. So we get to experience that along with the characters. Another way that a protagonist can become an outsider in the text is they may have trouble fitting in. In The Queen's Gambit, also on Netflix, Beth Harmon is sent to an orphanage after her mother dies in a car accident. And Beth is really, for one thing, she's really traumatized by what happened to her mom, but she's also very shy and kind of awkward and standoffish from the other girls. And she really only connects with one other person at the orphanage. And beyond that one friend, the only other person that Beth is probably close to is the janitor, Mr. Scheibel. And she discovers him playing chess in the basement and eventually convinces him to teach her to play. Now, what's I think kind of fascinating about Beth and her relationship with Mr. Scheibel is I don't think that she would say that he was her friend or that she was close to him or that she liked him. She really just liked playing chess. And then as Beth grows older, she struggles to form and maintain relationships with others, including her foster parents, including her fellow chess champions. You know, what's interesting in the show is that that group of chess players have a very small, intimate community, but even those who want to be close to Beth, she often pushes those people away, especially men. And that is something that we see again and again in the show. A protagonist may also be an outsider because they have some kind of distinguishing mark or characteristic. And a good example of this is in Wonder Woman 1984. So if you've seen the first movie, you know that in the first Wonder Woman, Diana Prince makes a lot of great relationships. She sort of finds a group of of friends. She finds a team that she can belong to and other people that she can depend on and rely on. But in Wonder Woman 1984, all of those people are gone. And the distinguishing characteristic is that Diana Prince hasn't aged, even though 64 years have passed since the end of the first movie. There's a really interesting scene at the beginning where we see a bunch of photographs of the people that she befriended in the first movie, and they've all become too elderly now. She really stands out among them because she looks so, I want to say different, but I guess the real word is the same. She just looks the same. And there's a great photo of her and one of the female characters, Etta Candy. And Etta's quite elderly in the picture, but Diana looks exactly the same. It's kind of hard to date when you're, you know, a 70-something-year-old woman, but you look like you're in your 20s or early 30s. So in the movie, she's often depicted alone, and she talks with the other characters about her loneliness and her isolation. And it's that outsider status that really drives the rest of the narrative. So when we're thinking about our protagonists as outsiders, we want to ask how that status affects their motivations and behavior. And in Kipo's example, she is someone who really trusts others. She is someone who takes a lot of risks and makes a lot of snap decisions. I think a lot of the time because she doesn't really understand the danger that she's in or the level of risk that she's undertaking. In The Queen's Gambit, Beth is really isolated and really lonely, and she finds it hard to break out of that, even when other people offer her a lifeline. And unfortunately, in the show, she turns to substance abuse to try to cope with that isolation. And in Wonder Woman 1984, and I'm going to try my best to not give anything away, okay, so no spoilers, no spoilers. But in Wonder Woman 1984, her outsider status is really what leads her to make a very crucial decision at the beginning of the movie and then struggle with the consequences of that decision throughout the rest of the story. That's all I'm going to say about Wonder Woman. The end. So as you're reading your novel, I want you to ask yourself what makes your protagonist an outsider and how that status influences them. Happy reading.